The snow fell in thick curtains over the Ardennes forest on December 16th, 1944, muffling the sound of 500,000 German soldiers massing in the darkness. Private Tommy Sullivan crouched in his foxhole, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air, completely unaware that he was about to experience the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would face in World War II. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and Tommy's quiet Christmas would turn into 89 days of hell. Just 3 years earlier, Tommy had been working at his father's hardware store in Brooklyn, arguing with his girlfriend Marie about whether they should get married before he shipped out. Pearl Harbor had changed everything. One Sunday morning, one surprise attack, and suddenly every young man in America was lining up to enlist. Tommy remembered exactly where he was when he heard the news, standing in his parents' kitchen, listening to President Roosevelt's voice crackling through the radio. "A date which will live in infamy!" His mother had cried. His father had simply nodded and said, "You'll be going, won't you?" Tommy had nodded back. There was never really a choice. Basic training at Fort Benning had been brutal but necessary. Tommy learned how to shoot, how to march, how to follow orders without thinking. He learned how to clean his M1 Garand rifle in under 2 minutes and how to dig a foxhole that might save his life. He learned the names of men who had become closer than brothers. Johnny from Texas, who could make anyone laugh, Marcus from Detroit, who played jazz trumpet, and Frank from Chicago, who had a photograph of his baby daughter that he showed everyone at least twice a day. They shipped out to England in the summer of 1944, part of the massive build-up for the invasion everyone knew was coming, but nobody could talk about. The waiting was almost worse than combat. Almost. When the orders finally came on June 5th, Tommy and his unit boarded landing craft in the middle of a storm that had already delayed the invasion by 24 hours. General Eisenhower had made the call. They were going, weather be damned. The English Channel was rougher than anything Tommy had experienced, and he spent most of the crossing with his head between his knees, trying not to vomit on his boots. Around him, men prayed, wrote last letters home, or simply stared into space. Some of the guys played cards. Johnny told jokes that nobody laughed at. Marcus hummed quietly, a tune Tommy didn't recognize. Frank clutched his daughter's photograph so tightly his knuckles turned white. The ramp dropped at Omaha Beach just after dawn on June 6th, and Tommy's world exploded into chaos. The first man off the landing craft took 3 bullets before his feet hit the water. The second fell forward, creating a bridge of flesh the others had to climb over. Tommy jumped into chest-deep water, his 70-pound pack immediately trying to drag him under. The sound was indescribable. Machine gun fire, explosions, men screaming, officers shouting orders that nobody could hear. Tommy waded forward because every instinct told him to move, to not stand still, to get to that beach, even though the beach was a killing field. A mortar round exploded 10 feet to his left, and the concussion wave lifted him off his feet. He went under, swallowed salt water and blood, came up gasping. Johnny was beside him, pulling him forward. They made it to the sand, threw themselves down behind a steel obstacle, and caught their breath for exactly 5 seconds before the German machine guns found them again. The beach was carpeted with bodies. Some were already dead. Others were wounded and calling for medics who couldn't reach them. Tommy saw a man trying to hold his intestines inside his body. He saw another man with no legs crawling toward the seawall. He saw things that would visit him in nightmares for the rest of his life. The battle for Omaha Beach lasted hours. Tommy and his unit advanced maybe 100 yards in the first hour, each yard paid for with American blood. They finally made it to the seawall, a concrete barrier that offered minimal protection from the German positions on the cliffs above. Tommy counted the men from his landing craft, 42 had boarded in England. 13 made it to the seawall. Johnny was there, his arm bleeding but his spirit intact. Marcus was there, though he'd lost his trumpet somewhere in the water. Frank was not there. Tommy would later learn that Frank had been hit in the water, had drowned under the weight of his equipment, and would never meet the daughter whose photograph he'd carried across an ocean. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold on Normandy, but the cost was staggering. Over 2,400 American casualties on Omaha Beach alone, with thousands more across the other landing zones. Tommy helped dig graves that evening, his hands numb from cold and exhaustion. They buried Frank with his photograph tucked into his uniform pocket. Johnny played taps on a borrowed bugle, his arm bandaged and his face streaked with tears. Marcus stood silent, staring at the ocean that had swallowed so many of their friends. This was what war really was. Not the heroic stories from newsreels, but mud and blood and the crushing weight of surviving when better men didn't. The campaign across France was a grinding advance through hedgerows and villages, each one defended by German soldiers who fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing. Tommy learned to sleep in muddy holes, to eat cold rations without tasting them, to march until his feet bled, and then march another 5 miles. He learned to tell the difference between incoming and outgoing artillery by sound alone. He learned that fear never went away, you just got better at functioning despite it. By August, they'd liberated Paris, and Tommy had stood on the Champs-Élysées watching French citizens throw flowers at American tanks. An old woman had kissed his cheek and called him her liberator. He'd smiled and nodded, but inside he felt hollow. Frank was still dead. Hundreds of his friends were still dead. Liberation was real, but it didn't resurrect the fallen. As autumn turned to winter, the Allied advance slowed. Supply lines stretched thin across France. The Germans fell back to their borders, and everyone believed the war would be over by Christmas. Tommy and his unit were sent to a quiet sector in Belgium to rest and refit. The Ardennes forest was considered a low priority zone. Thick woods, terrible roads, nothing the Germans would want. They were assigned to defensive positions along a 75-mile front, a line so thinly held that there were gaps of miles between units. It should have been a vacation compared to Normandy. It should have been safe. December the 16th, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German artillery began. Tommy jolted awake in his foxhole as shells screamed overhead, impacting all around his position. The barrage lasted 90 minutes, the most intense Tommy had experienced since Omaha Beach. When it finally stopped, the forest was eerily silent. Then they heard the tanks. The Germans had massed 3 armies, over 400,000 men, 1,400 tanks, and 4,200 artillery pieces, for one final desperate offensive. Hitler's plan was audacious and insane in equal measure. Punch through the American lines, drive to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and sue for a separate peace. It might have worked if the Americans hadn't fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. Tommy's position was overrun within hours. German panzer tanks rolled through the forest like steel monsters, crushing foxholes under their treads. Tommy and the survivors fell back, fighting a chaotic retreat through snow and trees. They'd lost contact with their command. They didn't know if they were cut off or if the entire front had collapsed. All they knew was that grey uniformed Germans seemed to be everywhere, and the snow that had seemed so peaceful that morning was now turning red. They linked up with other scattered units over the next day, forming a defensive position in a small Belgian village called Bastogne. The town sat at a critical crossroads, and if the Germans took it, they'd have a clear road to Antwerp. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe arrived with the 101st Airborne Division to hold the town, and Tommy's unit was attached to their defence. Within days, they were completely surrounded. German forces encircled Bastogne, cutting off all supply lines. Tommy and 18,000 other American soldiers were trapped, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The temperature dropped to below zero. Men developed frostbite and trench foot. The wounded couldn't be evacuated. They held anyway. The Germans sent a surrender demand to General McAuliffe on December 22nd. His response became legendary. Nuts! When his officers asked what he meant, McAuliffe clarified, "Tell them to go to hell." Tommy and the other defenders loved him for it. They were cold, hungry, and facing overwhelming odds, but they would not surrender. The siege of Bastogne lasted until December 26th, when elements of General Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and relieved the town. Tommy cried when he saw American tanks rolling up the road. He wasn't alone. Grown men, battle-hardened soldiers who'd faced death 100 times, wept openly at the sight of reinforcements. But the Battle of the Bulge was far from over. The fighting continued through January as the Americans pushed the Germans back to their original positions. Tommy fought through villages with names he couldn't pronounce, through forests so cold that rifle bolts froze solid, through snowstorms that made visibility impossible. They found German soldiers frozen to death at their posts. They found American soldiers the same way. Johnny took shrapnel in both legs during an artillery barrage and was evacuated. Tommy and Marcus carried him to the aid station, both men knowing they might never see their friend again. Marcus was shot by a sniper 3 days later. The bullet went through his chest, and he died in Tommy's arms. His last words, something about his trumpet, about jazz, about wanting to go home. Tommy buried him in the frozen ground, using his helmet as a shovel because the earth was too hard for anything else. By the time the Battle of the Bulge officially ended in late January 1945, American casualties numbered over 89,000, 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. German casualties were even higher, around 100,000 total. The Wehrmacht had thrown everything into their last offensive and failed. Germany would never recover. Tommy had survived again, but he'd lost Marcus. Johnny was in a hospital in England. Frank was still buried in Normandy. Half the men Tommy had trained with at Fort Benning were dead or wounded. He was promoted to sergeant and given a squad of replacements. Teenagers who looked at him like he was ancient, though he was only 23 years old. As winter gave way to spring, the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into Germany. The Wehrmacht collapsed. Its vaunted war machine reduced to pockets of resistance and desperate last stands. Tommy's unit advanced rapidly now, sometimes covering 20 miles a day. German soldiers surrendered in droves. Many of them relieved the war was finally ending. Others fought with fanatical determination, especially the SS units and Hitler Youth. Tommy's squad liberated a small town in Bavaria in early April. The civilians claimed they knew nothing about the war, about the atrocities, about what had been done in their name. They hung white sheets from their windows and avoided eye contact with the American soldiers. 2 days later, Tommy's unit received orders to investigate a camp nearby. The locals called it Dachau. They said it was a labour camp, nothing more. They were lying. Tommy smelled it before he saw it. Death and disease and human suffering concentrated into a stench that made grown men vomit. The camp gates bore the inscription Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. It was a lie, one of countless lies that had enabled the Holocaust. Inside, Tommy found hell on earth. Barracks filled with skeletal prisoners too weak to stand. Piles of corpses stacked like firewood. A crematorium with ovens designed for burning human bodies. A gas chamber disguised as a shower room. Train cars filled with dead prisoners who'd suffocated during transport. Tommy had seen death before. He'd seen it on Omaha Beach, in the Ardennes, in 100 battles across Europe. But this was different. This wasn't soldiers killing soldiers. This was systematic, industrial murder. This was genocide. The prisoners who could still move stumbled toward the Americans, reaching out with skeletal hands, speaking in languages Tommy didn't understand, but needing no translation. They were the survivors of a system designed to exterminate them. Jews, Roma, political prisoners, homosexuals, disabled people, and anyone else the Nazis deemed unworthy of life. Tommy's squad shared their rations with the survivors, though the medics warned that feeding starving people too much too quickly could kill them. They called for medical units, for supplies, for anything that might help, but mostly they just witnessed. They witnessed what humanity was capable of when hatred and ideology combined with state power. Tommy met a man named Jakob, who spoke broken English. Jakob had been a teacher in Munich before the war. The Nazis had arrested him in 1938 for being Jewish. He'd spent 7 years in Dachau, watching thousands die from starvation, disease, and execution. His wife and children had been sent to Auschwitz. He didn't know if they were alive or dead. As Tommy listened to Jakob's story, he understood that he was standing at the end point of a horror that stretched across Europe. Dachau was just one camp. There were hundreds of others. Millions had been murdered in the Holocaust, 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims. The scale was incomprehensible. The liberation of the camps was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but Tommy felt no triumph. He felt rage and sorrow and a deep, abiding shame that this had been allowed to happen. The world had known. Reports had been filtering out for years. The Allies had photographic evidence of the camps as early as 1944. But stopping the Holocaust hadn't been a military priority. Winning the war had been the priority, and liberation came as a consequence of military advancement, not as a goal in itself. Tommy spent 3 days helping at Dachau before his unit moved on. 3 days that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took photographs with a camera he'd picked up in France, not because he wanted to remember, but because he knew people wouldn't believe it. Future generations would need proof that this had really happened, that human beings had really done this to other human beings. The photographs showed emaciated prisoners, mass graves, the machinery of death. They were unbearable to look at. They were necessary to preserve. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Tommy stood in the rubble of Berlin, surrounded by his squad, listening to the news over a portable radio. Men cheered and fired their weapons into the air. Some cried, others simply sat down, too exhausted to feel anything. Tommy thought about Frank, buried in Normandy, about Marcus, frozen in the Ardennes, about Johnny, who'd hopefully survived his wounds, about Jacob and the millions who hadn't survived the camps. Victory was real, but it felt hollow. The war had cost too much, revealed too much about the darkness humanity carried inside itself. Tommy returned to the United States in July 1945, sailing into New York Harbor past the Statue of Liberty. The city threw a parade. Strangers kissed soldiers in Times Square. It was jubilant and overwhelming and deeply surreal. Tommy stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching the celebration, and felt completely disconnected from it. These people hadn't seen what he'd seen. They hadn't experienced the war the way he had. The newsreels and radio reports had sanitized it, turned it into a story about heroes and villains, good versus evil. The reality was infinitely more complex and painful. He took a train to Brooklyn, his duffel bag over his shoulder, his uniform bearing the ribbons and badges of his service. His parents met him at the station. His mother cried. His father shook his hand and said, "Welcome home, son." Marie was there too. She'd waited for him, written him letters every week, sent care packages that rarely arrived. They'd talked about getting married before he shipped out, but had decided to wait. Now she looked at him with hope and concern in equal measure. "Are you okay?" she asked. Tommy wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her he was fine, that he'd survived, that they could start their life together now. Instead he said, "I don't know." They got married anyway 3 months later, in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church. Johnny was Tommy's best man. He'd survived his wounds and was walking with a cane. Marcus's mother came to the wedding and gave Tommy her son's trumpet mouthpiece. Tommy kept it in his pocket for the next 40 years. Readjusting to civilian life was harder than Tommy expected. He'd been at war for nearly 3 years, had gone from a boy to a man in the crucible of combat. The hardware store his father owned seemed impossibly trivial now. Selling nails and screwdrivers to people complaining about minor inconveniences made Tommy want to scream. Didn't they know what was happening in the world? Didn't they understand what had been sacrificed? But of course they didn't. That was the point. Tommy had fought so they wouldn't have to know, so they could live normal lives, worried about normal things. The nightmares started within a month of his return. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, Marie shaking him awake, telling him he'd been screaming. He'd dream about Omaha Beach, about the Ardennes, about Dachau. The dreams mixed together into a surreal horror show. Frank drowning while wearing striped camp uniform. Marcus frozen to death in a gas chamber. Jakob leading a charge across Normandy. Tommy would sit up in bed at 3 a.m., his heart racing, unable to distinguish between memory and nightmare. He started drinking to help him sleep. It didn't help. Marie suggested he talk to someone, but Tommy refused. What would he say? How could he explain what he'd seen to someone who hadn't been there? The other veterans in the neighbourhood understood without words. They'd gather at a local bar, men who'd fought in Europe or the Pacific, and drink in companionable silence. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't need to. The weight of it sat on all their shoulders, an invisible burden that civilians couldn't see, but veterans couldn't shake. Tommy's son was born in 1947. They named him Frank, after the friend who'd never met his own daughter. Holding the baby for the first time, Tommy felt something crack open inside him. A possibility that life might be worth living, after all, that maybe he could build something good out of the wreckage of war. He threw himself into fatherhood with an intensity that sometimes frightened Marie. He needed to protect this child, to make sure young Frank grew up in a world where the horrors Tommy had witnessed could never happen again. As the years passed, Tommy slowly built a new life. He took over his father's hardware store and turned it into a modest success. He coached Little League and attended PTA meetings. He taught his son how to fish and how to fix a car. On the surface, he looked like every other suburban father in 1950s America. But the war never left him. Every December 16th, he'd wake up thinking about the Ardennes. Every June 6th, he'd remember Omaha Beach. And sometimes, without warning, he'd smell something that reminded him of Dachau, and he'd have to excuse himself and sit alone until the shaking stopped. In 1960, Tommy was contacted by a man named David Goldman, a journalist working on a book about Dachau survivors. David had been given Tommy's name by Jacob, the teacher Tommy had met at Liberation. Incredibly, Jacob had survived. He'd immigrated to Israel and spent 15 years rebuilding his life. His wife and children had not survived Auschwitz. David wanted to interview Tommy about the liberation, about what he'd seen. Tommy initially refused. He'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Why would he want to dredge it all up again? Marie convinced him. Maybe it would help, she said. Maybe telling the story would help you finally process it. Tommy agreed to meet David at a coffee shop in Manhattan. They talked for 4 hours. Tommy described the liberation in detail. The smell, the survivors, the machinery of death. He showed David the photographs he'd taken, images he'd kept hidden in a shoebox for 15 years. David listened with a recording device running, taking notes, asking gentle questions. When Tommy finished, David sat back and said, "You know the world needs to hear this, right? People are already starting to forget. Some are even claiming it didn't happen. Your testimony, your photographs, they're evidence, they're proof." Tommy felt a responsibility settle on him, different from the weight he'd been carrying, but equally heavy. David published his book in 1962, and it included Tommy's testimony and photographs. Tommy received letters from around the world, from other survivors, from the children of victims, from people thanking him for bearing witness. He also received hate mail from neo-Nazis and Holocaust deniers calling him a liar. He burned those letters without reading past the first paragraph. The truth needed no defense from liars. In the 1970s, Tommy started speaking at schools and synagogues about his experiences. He'd show his photographs, tell his stories, and answer questions from students who saw World War II as ancient history. "Why did you fight?" they'd ask. "Were you scared?" "What was it like to kill someone?" Tommy answered honestly. He fought because his country asked him to, because stopping fascism and genocide was necessary, because sometimes evil had to be confronted with force. Yes, he was terrified every single day. And killing someone, even an enemy soldier, left scars that never healed. Tommy lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, watched on television as the Cold War ended and the world changed again. He lived long enough to see his son Frank become a teacher, to meet his grandchildren, to be honoured at the 50th anniversary commemoration of D-Day in 1994. He returned to Normandy that year, standing on Omaha Beach with other elderly veterans, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. He placed flowers where he thought Frank might have fallen, though the ocean had long since erased all evidence of that terrible day. He visited the American cemetery above the beach, walking among 9,388 white crosses and stars of David, each one representing a life cut short, a future stolen. He found Frank's grave. His friend had been recovered from the water and buried with his brothers in arms. The photograph was gone, rotted away decades ago, but Tommy had brought a copy. He placed it on the grave and said goodbye properly, 50 years late. Tommy passed away in 2003 at the age of 82. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his liberation of Dachau, his years of testimony about the Holocaust. But what his family remembered most was the man himself. The father who coached Little League despite his nightmares. The grandfather who told stories about courage and sacrifice. The man who carried the weight of history but never let it crush his capacity for love. At his funeral, Jacob's son Daniel spoke. Jacob had passed away in 1998, but he'd maintained correspondence with Tommy for nearly 40 years. "My father always said that Tommy Sullivan saved his life twice," Daniel told the assembled mourners. "Once by liberating Dachau, and once by remembering what happened there, by refusing to let the world forget. That was a different kind of liberation, but no less important." Tommy's story was not unique. 16 million Americans served in World War II. Over 400,000 died. Millions more came home carrying invisible wounds that would shape the rest of their lives. They fought in Europe and the Pacific, in deserts and jungles and frozen forests. They stormed beaches and liberated camps and dropped bombs that ended the war, but raised moral questions that persist to this day. They defeated fascism and saved the world from tyranny, but the cost was almost unbearable. In the years since Tommy's death, his son Frank has continued his father's work, speaking to schools about World War II and the Holocaust. He brings his father's photographs and medals, tells his father's stories, and tries to make history real for generations who know it only from textbooks and video games. My father used to say that the war taught him two things, Frank tells the students. First, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when they surrender their moral judgment to ideology and authority. And second, that ordinary people are also capable of extraordinary courage and compassion when they choose to stand against that evil. He believed those lessons were the most important things he could pass on, more important than any specific battle or date. The hardware store in Brooklyn closed in 2010, replaced by a chain store that sells the same nails and screwdrivers. But the stories remain. Tommy's testimony is archived in multiple Holocaust museums. His photographs are used in documentaries and textbooks. His life is a thread in the vast tapestry of World War II, one of millions of threads that together form a picture of humanity at its worst and its best. And every year on June 6th, Frank makes the trip to Normandy. He stands on Omaha Beach at dawn, watching the waves roll in, thinking about his father and the uncle he was named after, about the men who died here and the men who survived. He thinks about Jacob and the millions who died in the camps, about the cost of victory and the importance of memory. The beach is peaceful now, a tourist destination with cafes and souvenir shops. But if you know where to look, you can still find remnants of the war, rusted metal in the sand, bunkers in the cliffs, the weight of history pressing down on this stretch of French coastline. Frank places 2 flowers in the sand, one for his uncle, one for his father. The tide will wash them away within hours, but that's okay. Memory isn't about physical objects. It's about stories told and lessons learned, and the determination to never forget what was sacrificed here, what was lost here, what was won here. The sun rises over the English Channel, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The same sky that dawned over this beach on June 6th, 1944. The same sky that will dawn tomorrow and the day after, long after the last veteran has passed, long after the last witness is gone. But as long as there are people willing to remember, willing to tell the stories, willing to learn the lessons, the sacrifice will not have been in vain. Tommy Sullivan's war ended in 1945, but his testimony continues. A bridge between past and present. A reminder of what was and what must never be again. In the end, that's what all the veterans wanted. Not glory or recognition, but simply this: that we remember, that we learn, and that we never let it happen again.